Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councillor Sonia Winifred, the Cabinet Member for Equalities and Culture. Welcome to the first of our community engagement meetings to share, discuss and hear your views and opinions on the findings of our audit on statues, monuments and street names in Lambeth with links to slavery and colonialism. We thought it was right to take this forward and engage the community and our stakeholders, as Lambeth is a very proud and diverse borough which has previously taken steps to lead on commemorating Black leaders in the late 20th century. We must now, we feel, chart a new route forward to look at proposals to review existing troubling or historic links and assess whether we can legally suggest new names or commemorations to mark the lives and contributions to key people who have made Lambeth the place that it is today. And we wanted to take this lead because I'm sure, as you all know, that following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, the global movement united under the banner of Black Lives Matter, and they mobilised to raise awareness of racism, Black identity and history. Within the UK, the Black Lives Matter pressured local government, private organisations and companies to remove any and all artwork, memorials, statues and street names with direct or indirect link to the transatlantic slave trade. The campaign's big moment came when in Bristol, where a group of Black Lives Matter activists forcibly removed the statue of Edward Colston, with global media coverage and a wide debate sparked on Britain's colonial past. Edward Colston was MP for Bristol, but also became rich as a result of his activity in slave trading, on which part of his fortune had been made when he was deputy governor of the Royal African Company in the 17th century. Immediately following the action, localised Black Lives Matter again campaigned, called for local councils to do the same, to review the public realm and assess the extent of similar statues or other fixtures, including street names. And Lambeth was one of the first boroughs to take a lead on this, launching an audit into our public realm. And we felt it most important to involve our communities and stakeholders, that it was crucial that we did this, our community groups, schools, private organisations, businesses, to engage them in the debate itself. And any decisions the council makes in the future on new naming proposals, and this needs to be, we need to include key figures such as Olive Morris, Terence Higgins, who was the first HIV person to die of the disease in Lambeth, and whose name was so closely associated with the leading charity, the Terence Higgins Trust. Mary Seacole, and key locations and statues associated with events such as the Sharpeville massacre in apartheid South Africa, among many others. And I must stress to you that I'm very much looking forward to this debate, this process, and I'm eager to hear the views and proposals for any changes from our residents, stakeholders, as this is a very sensitive issue, and the council will lead this exercise in a way which acknowledges different views and opinions. And different views and opinions will be heard, as indeed I've already acknowledged some actions taken by some of our main institutions to begin this uncomfortable dialogue, debate or narrative, whichever you choose to call it. On the 9th of June, the Museum of London made a public statement regarding the Robert Milligan statue that stood in front of the Museum of London in Docklands, and later that same day the statue was removed by local authorities in response to worldwide movements to remove statues that commemorate supporters of slavery. The British Museum's removal from his pedestal of the bust of its founder, Sir Hans Sloane, a slave owner who partly funded his collection from enslaved labour on Jamaican sugar plantations. His artifacts provided the starting point for what we know as the British Museum. His bust is now placed in a secure cabinet alongside artifacts explaining his work in the context of the British Empire. The National Trust came under fire in September when they published a report, Colonialism and Historic Slavery, examining the properties with links to relationships with links to the slave trade and colonialism. Much to the disappointment, I might add, of some large numbers of MPs who are now recommending the trust funding be reviewed. I suppose one can only assume they are so disappointed in the trust actions. So there is much for us to do and much to discuss. So I would like to, at this point, thank all of you, our listeners, those who joined the meeting. I'm told there's almost 500 of you here. Just to apologise for the late start, technical difficulties. Also, I will be supporting me this afternoon with the event is Archivist John Newman, and I also have two special guests, Debbie Wicks-Bernard and Dawn Hill. Now, Debbie is a Deputy Mayor for Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement. Debbie, would you mind coming in now and just saying a few words and just introducing yourself to our listeners?
Thank you so much, Sonia. I'm really delighted to be part of this event, and it's amazing to hear that you've got 500 people listening to us this afternoon, which is wonderful, because it's a really important debate that we are having today. I mean, just by way of introduction, the work that I do at City Hall is to support the Mayor to do all we can to reduce some of those huge inequalities that I know exist in our city, to reduce poverty and to promote positive integration amongst all of our communities. I think the only thing I really want to say is that we are ourselves embarking upon a piece of work that will enable us to look more proactively at how we have a more diverse and more representative public realm. The Commission on the Diversity of the Public Realm was announced by the Mayor on the 9th of June. It will involve us working with 15 individuals who will act as commissioners, who will help us to try to think about what it is that we need to do to look at the way in which we remember, memorialise, and also represent all of the diversity that exists within our city. But the thing to add here is what will make that piece of work a success is having a really good, strong leadership from all sectors. And so it's a real pleasure to be here with you, Sonia, to see Lambeth taking such a leadership role in looking carefully and in clear consultation with all of its residents at what Lambeth's public realm looks like. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and we are delighted to have you here, and hopefully we'll hear more of the Diversity Public Realm committee that's been set up, and I myself taking a particular interest in that. If I'd like to now call Dawn, if Dawn's joined us, Dawn Hill. Dawn is the chair of the BCA, the Black Cultural Archives, and Dawn has been part of the Black Cultural Archives since 1981 and working very closely with the founder of the Black Cultural Archives, the late Len Garrison. So Dawn, can we hear from you a few words? Do we have Dawn with us? Okay, we don't appear to have Dawn. We can always come back later to have a word with Dawn. I just wanted to again thank everyone who's joined this meeting. It just the sheer volume highlights the importance of having this debate, and it's not going to be an easy task. We know that, but we are open to this consultation process. There will be also online consultations later on during the meeting. People can post their questions online because Debbie, myself and Dawn and our archivist John Newman will be trying to answer your questions. Obviously, there is absolutely no way we will be able to answer all your questions, but this is the first of a few of our consultation meetings. So if you haven't been able to get a response on this occasion, hopefully the next one, but we also have an online consultation where you can post your comments, because they are most welcome and we're looking forward to seeing them. So I think I will at this stage hand over to John Newman, one of our archivists. John has been leading, John as well as his job share, Len Riley, the archivist in Lambeth, have been leading on this audit for us, and they've done some exceptional work, as you will see when John presents our findings. Over to you then, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, just a very quick word of introduction. My name is John Newman. I'm one of the two archives managers, and we were tasked in the summer by the council to carry out a preliminary audit of statues, memorials, and street names with demonstrable links with slavery and/or colonialism. And what I'm about to show you is a very quick series of headlines from some of those findings. I'll talk slightly later on about the kind of methodology that we engaged with to do this piece of work, but I hope that what I'm able to show you now, just in a kind of quick 15-minute presentation, will better inform this this consultation process and allow us to understand the kind of the scope of what we're talking about in terms of legacy in Lambeth. What I'm about to do now is just open up a PowerPoint. There'll be a slight pause while I just get that called up. Bear with me one moment. Okay, I hope you can all see that. This presentation will take about 15 minutes, and then we'll pass on to the panel discussion. So, statues, monuments, and street names in Lambeth with links to slavery and colonialism. One of the points I'll be trying to make during this is just how murky and unclear an area that sometimes is. I think as part of this process, we need to be as well informed as we are able, and sometimes the surviving historic record doesn't necessarily allow us to be completely certain about that. Let me illustrate this with two images here. On the left, William Vassell. Born in Jamaica, then moved to Boston, then after the American Civil War, the American War of Independence, moved to London and settled in Clapham, part of his income being derived from slave plantations that he continued to maintain back in Jamaica. And then on the right, we have Henry Tulse, who was director of the Royal Africa Company and was for a year in the 1680s Lord Mayor of London, who had very clear links to slavery, and again this was part of the basis of his wealth. Both would immediately suggest links with roads and indeed wards in Lambeth, but we need to proceed with caution. The William Vassell here is not the same Vassell of Vassell Road and Vassell Ward, though I'll come on to him and her in a minute. Henry Tulse, the Tulse family held three very small manors in Lambeth, indeed the lands around the area of what is now Tulse Hill, and it's quite clear that the area name and street name Tulse Hill derives from that family's ownership of these manors. And we know that Henry Tulse was a later 17th century descendant of the same family, but at the moment we're not completely clear whether Henry Tulse owned those manors as well, or whether there was a connection with Lambeth. So one needs to have a certain amount of caution and indeed a certain amount of probably further research on this. What we can be clear, though, is that another Vassell family, Elizabeth and Henry Vassell Fox, also Lord and Lady Holland, were clear beneficiaries from the slave trade. Elizabeth held plantations in Westmoreland, Jamaica, and we know from the detailed work done by the UCL Legacies on British Slave Ownership database that together they were awarded over £7,000 compensation for their loss, or for the freedom of their 401 slaves on their plantation at Westmoreland in 1836. The Vassalls were absentee landlords. They owned the Holland estate in Brixton, which was developed between the 1820s and the 1850s, and many of the street names within that old estate reflect directly the family. We have Vassall Road, we have Foxley Road, we have Lord Holland Lane, and the Myattsfield South rebuild, and there are other names linking with members of their family. I mean, not unsurprisingly, it's a perfectly normal pattern for landholders when developing their former agricultural lands as housing around the suburbs of London in the 19th century, to commemorate or to name the new streets after themselves, and we see this process clearly in the Holland estate. Another figure with very clear links to slavery, and another Clapham figure, was George Hibbert, who had extensive plantation holdings and slaves in Jamaica, who was a very wealthy merchant, and was involved in the formation of the West India Docks Company, beginning of the 19th century, lived in Clapham, and who, after his death, his two daughters set up the Hibbert almshouses, which are still there on the Wandsworth Road. 1859. Again, there's a question of linkage. It's probably clear that the money that enabled the foundation of the charitable almshouses came in part from Hibbert's wealth, which also in part derives from the slave trade. So we can see an indirect link there between Hibbert's later legacies in Lambeth and his activities as a slave owner. An Archbishop of Canterbury is also up for consideration. Archbishop William Juxon, who became Charles II's Archbishop in 1660, and who rebuilt the Great Hall at Lambeth, until recently Lambeth Council Library, in the 1660s, just before his death. We see him on his deathbed on the left there in 1663. Previously Charles I, Bishop of London, he was actually on the scaffold with Charles I, taking his final prayers when Charles I was executed in the 1640s. He acquired a coat of arms for his family in the mid-1630s, and the four black heads of the Juxon coat of arms can still be seen reflected around Lambeth Palace in some of the fittings and decoration and statuary in the Great Hall. The symbolism of the four black heads is unclear, but we do know that Juxon's grandfather was a sugar trader trading with the West Indies, and it may well be that the heraldic devices here are seen as a kind of celebration of his family's involvement in that trade in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. rather more tangential and if nothing else, an indication of just how pervasive the slave trade and the slave economy was in 17th and 18th century Britain. The trader scants, who we know well as botanists, gardeners and collectors, were tangentially but necessarily involved with the slave trade, in the sense that they were using slave trade vessels to bring back their plant specimens and anthropological specimens to their house on South Lambeth Road, where they had their museum collection and their garden grounds. There's a letter from their patron, the Duke of Buckingham, in the 17th century, on behalf of John Senior, to the captains of vessels going to the Guinea coast, asking for their assistance with in bringing back specimens for the trader scants. So we can see an attenuated link with the slave trade there, just as we can with William Bligh, seen on the right, who ended up living on Lambeth Road, and where a blue plaque commemorates the house that he lived at. He's best known as the villainous Captain Bligh of the Mutiny on the Bounty. What sometimes gets overlooked in the Hollywood retellings of the story is that what he was actually engaged in on that voyage was the transportation of breadfruit plants from the Pacific to the Caribbean to be introduced as a possible food staple for plantation slaves, and indeed it was thus. The breadfruit is now part of the Caribbean diet in the West Indies. Documents in our own collections are revealing too. The John Hankey of Streatham Common here. This is his will. He doesn't survive in terms of names or memorials in Lambeth, but this will here is kind of an instance of the kind of documentation that was supporting the process of slave owning, and brings home the kind of the chattel status of the whole system, that human beings became property indistinguishable from lands, tenements, utensils, and hereditaments, another property that could be left in a will. Some of those slaves even found their way to Lambeth. As we know from earlier researches, there was a small but significant population of former slaves being baptised in Lambeth. These are two entries from the Lambeth parish registers of the 18th century, reminding us that there was as well as the basic plantation economy in the Caribbean and in North America, there was a steady supply of particularly young men coming to Britain to work as servants for white families. And in the lower of the two, we even see the flowing through of that plantation convention of naming slaves after the place on which they're living. These two boys being baptised William Lambeth and Richard Lambeth in 1770 when working as servants to John Knott on Kennington Lane. What we mustn't, of course, forget too is that while Lambeth, like the rest of London, was full of people who were enthusiastic adopters and beneficiaries of the slave economy, there was also in Lambeth and Clapham in particular a significant and important coterie of individuals who were violently opposed to the slave trade. William Wilberforce is obviously the key name, but we still see John Venn, the rector of Holy Trinity Clapham, and Zachary Macaulay, who helped set up the African Academy in Clapham to educate young boys from Sierra Leone. We find them commemorated in street names in Lambeth today. So there is an important and another side to the question of the slave legacy as seen in street names and monuments in the work of those members of the Clapham sect. This is I've just included this image because it's another reminder that within Lambeth there was opposition to the slave trade as well as enthusiastic participation in it. This is actually an advertisement, very bizarrely, an advertisement for candles. Price's candle factory was at the foot of Vassell Bridge in the 1840s, and they were just beginning to make a new type of stearine candle from palm oil from West Africa, and this advertisement is a very curious one in the way that it is nakedly promoting their own products, but through the kind of ethical message of the anti-slavery campaign. The candle maker in the centre is burning through the slave trader's rope, which is tied around the slave. It's an extraordinary image. One assumes that ethical advertising and virtue signalling are peculiarly the preserve of the 21st century, but here we see it happily at work in the 1840s. Sonia, in her introduction, talked about the way that the statues in particular had become focuses for the Black Lives Matter movement over this summer, and there are. I want to talk about two Lambeth statues. The one on the left is in the grounds of St Thomas's Hospital and is the statue of Robert Clayton, who was both the president of St Thomas's Hospital in the 18th century, but also a member of the Royal Africa Company and a major beneficiary of the wealth generated by the slave trade. His statue has already been covered over by St Thomas's governors, and they are now engaged in a similar process of historical research and consultation to the one that Lambeth is engaged in here. But a couple of observations on this statue. The sculptor is Grinling Gibbons, who was quite a famous English carver and sculptor, and the statue is Grade 1 listed, so that there are various bureaucratic processes that mean that simply removing that statue is perhaps going to be more complicated than first envisaged. The second image is a very complex one. It's a photo of the bust of Henry Tate, which can be seen in Windrush Square, standing in front of the Tate Brixton Library. There's a second bust to Tate in Streatham Library, and his house and his memorial in West Norwood Cemetery. His house in Streatham, his memorial in West Norwood Cemetery, also survive. He was, as the clue is in the name, he was involved in what later became the Tate and Lyle Sugar Company, and was retired to Lambeth in the 1880s or late 1870s as a very wealthy individual. But again, one needs to be very precise and very careful about one's history and particularly dates. Tate completely postdates the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and he was a mere teenager when slavery itself was abolished in 1833. It's quite clear that he has no direct linkage with slavery. The issue, and it's one that has been explored in some detail by Tate Britain in compiling its own research statement around its position on its founder, because Henry Tate was also the founder of the Tate Gallery on Bankside. Tate Britain's position, I can read you what they say. We believe that although clearly he was not involved in the slave trade, that the firm founded by Tate does, quote, connect to slavery in less direct but fundamental ways. Again, it is this issue of kind of what is the limitation in terms of one's liability or responsibility. There's no question that the firm that Tate led and benefited hugely from the earlier plantation economy that allowed sugar to be produced inexpensively in the Caribbean. Does that then continue to be reflected in his activities in Lambeth, particularly when what he was actually engaged in Lambeth were largely philanthropic works in terms of the creation of open spaces or the creation of public libraries. Three of Lambeth's libraries, for example, still currently bear his name in South Lambeth, in Streatham and in Brixton. So those are just some of the kind of problems that we were wrestling with in this process, and highlighted some of them in this presentation for you. The kind of summary document on statues and memorials is now available online, and you can see the full list of place names, statues and memorials that we've identified in our researches so far. And to kind of to bring out that uncertainty around degrees of linkage, we've offered up a kind of traffic light system in red, yellow, green, kind of indicating what we consider to be kind of degrees of involved linkage with the slave trade. It's not a complete document, and part of this consultation process is about asking people to contribute their own suggestions on this. It was worked up by the archives team, the three of us, over the summer, using a range of resources that we had hands on, not just the documents within the archives itself, but important other external areas of research like DMB and like the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database and local histories. We would be the first to acknowledge that it is not necessarily complete, and that there is still work in process, and we'd welcome your comments on that. Just to flag up one particular issue with street naming, I've already suggested that there are some issues around being absolutely certain about whether or not a street name is commemorating an individual. This is sometimes notoriously difficult. There can be many street names are simply surnames, and one cannot be clear whether or not the individual being identified is actually a particular person. And we make that clear in the back section of the report with some of our unclear or non-local names. I just want to, in the final 5 minutes, wrapping this up, finish by going back to the mid-1980s, when between 1984 and 1986, and Sonia alluded to this in her introduction, Lambeth Council engaged in quite a major exercise in street naming. Or in street renaming and building renaming. This of course was the Ted Knight's administration in Lambeth between 1984 and 1986, and Sharon Atkin, the then chair, came up with some really quite radical proposals for renaming of parks and libraries and streets. And the focus for Lambeth at that point was the struggle in South Africa. And in 1984, the council came up with a declaration agreeing to both supporting the struggle in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and seeking to rename premises in Lambeth, and engaged in quite an extensive programme of renaming of council buildings, inviting really quite significant people from the ANC over to Lambeth to open buildings in their name. Here's Ellen Kuzwe of the ANC opening the Health and Consumer Services building on Clapham Park Road. Huge numbers of such buildings were renamed after black figures, council buildings, and almost all of those have vanished. Paul Rebson House on South Lambeth Road, which was the Department of Technical Services, is now Holiday Inn. Oliver Morris House on Brixton Hill, which was customer care centre is now in the process of being demolished and rebuilt. Mary Seacole Centre on Clapham is one of the few survivors. Most of the others have gone. Atkins' larger proposals to rename parks and libraries after figures from the African liberation struggle or other significant black figures came up against such violent opposition, partly because it was done without any consultation at all with people of Lambeth, that it fell by the wayside. The only other survivor from it is Max Roach Park in Brixton, named after the bebop drummer Maxwell Roach. But what that initiative also inspired was a raft of new statuary memorialising in Lambeth, and we can see Linda Bellos here in 1990 opening the Sharpeville Massacre Memorial in Brixton, and there were subsequent pieces of statuary like the Soweto Memorial in Brixton and the Mandela statue on the South Bank. More recently, the Bronze Organ in Stockwell and the African and Caribbean War Memorial in Windrush Square that opened in 2017. Street naming, there are also some from the 80s. Again, we get this initiative to rename. Again, significant figures from the ANC being invited to Lambeth to open modest council housing named after them. Walter Sisulu coming to open Walter House on Sisulu Place here in 1984, and other initiatives after the '84 Olympics. The new Lambeth Council estate just off Heath Road, off the Wandsworth Road. All of the streets there are named after black athletes participating in the '84 Olympics. And there's the rather witty Poets' Corner on Shakespeare Road between Brixton and Herne Hill, paralleling the existing Poets' Corner of Milton, Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Spencer, with black poets and writers like Langston Hughes, Walcott, and Louise Bennett. And then finally, we can see how this initiative has kind of continued through. For example, in the renaming of streets on the new rebuild of the Angeltown estate at the beginning of the 21st century. Dora Botemar was one of the community campaigners who was involved in getting the old Angeltown demolished. She's celebrated in Dora Way and in the Memorial Park in the middle of the estate. And probably most significant of all, the renaming of the Tate Library Gardens in Brixton, which was extended and redesigned and renamed as Windrush Square in 2010. Okay, I'm going to stop there and pass over back to the chair.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Quite an extensive presentation, and what it does clearly outline is the small number of Lambeth street names have clear associations with the transatlantic slave trade and historic and exploitative economic exploitation during the early 18th century. Also, number of memorials commemorating key individuals who were involved in the slave trade. I would just, you mentioned some of the later 1980s and street names and the difficulties. Yes, we did say this was not going to be easy. It's a long process. However, what I have found is that some of our residents have been posting or forwarding and emailing their suggestions for possible commemorations of residents, local communities, activists such as Darcus Howe, who was a British broadcaster, writer and racial justice campaigner, and one of the Mangrove Nine. He also established the Race Today collective. Got Olive Morris, Ray Ellington, musician, and William Coffey. He was the Chartist, who led the Chartist rally in 1848. So a number of those are coming through. Do we have Dawn with us now? Dawn Hill? No? Okay, I'll go straight through to the questions. So some of our those online been posting questions. And the first question, actually, I think is for John and myself. It says, how can Lambeth residents best support this process? Well, they've already started. Some of you have begun supporting the process by sending in your thoughts, ideas, and I just ask that you continue doing so through the online consultation. It will take some time, and there will be other engagement meetings. So it's as we continue. This is the very first one. I think we are learning as we continue how we can take this forward and how best we can involve our residents even more. John, did you want to say anything, to add anything onto that question as a Lambeth person?
No. I think what you've said is clear, that people should add stuff to the consultation area on the website. Yes.
Yeah, another one, it says, I would also suggest the council consider the inverse of your question. How can Lambeth Council support its residents in the process? Where is the provision to address these traumatic histories and the realities of living in the aftermath? And that's a really good question, a really excellent one, actually. And again, this is as we take this forward. We're learning through COVID. If anything, it's taught us that we have to reassess our lives. It's highlighted the disproportionality within our communities, and we are taking forward a number of community engagements outside this process. So it's about pulling all those together. So that's a very good question. Thank you. Debbie, I think this one will come to you because it's a broader one. If you remove signs, statues, etc., where will you put them? They're part of history, and I feel should be put somewhere so generations can learn real, total history.
Thanks, Sonia. And can I just say, I've learned so much about Lambeth just from that presentation from John. I don't know Lambeth that well. I used to come to it as a child. I was educated in a school in Fulham, but I had no idea about the history of renaming that your borough has, and it shows some real forward thinking that has been characteristic, I think, of this borough for an incredibly long time. So that was I've learned so much. I think that's a really good question. The commission, so I can refer back to the commission. So the commission itself it's not been established yet. We're still recruiting our 15 commissioners, and we will have 15 people alongside a partners board, and also we're trying to develop a borough working group, so working with all of the boroughs across the whole of the city to help us with some of this decision making. And what we don't want to be in the position of making decisions about what happens in London. I don't think it's our place to do that in respect of this particular issue. But I think the point that your questioner raises is a good one. I know that when Colston came down in Bristol, that there was lots of debate about what should then happen to that statue, and there were some suggestions that the statue be put in a place where others similar to it, so other statues or memorials of those who've got links to the transatlantic slave trade, could be placed so that people could go to that place and see exactly who was memorialized and why, and to in a sense also acknowledge what happened this summer. So not touch the statue, not make any changes to it, and just put it in a place and people can go to it and look at it in a different context, not in a context of memorializing or venerating an individual, but recognizing quite clearly his links to the murder of so many Africans. And so I think I would never want to prejudge what our commissioners say, but it could be that if there are items that Londoners say that they want to remove, that we then think about where those pieces are placed, and it may be that they're placed in some other institution, a museum possibly, which is also used as a place in which we can think about and reflect on the history of the slave trade and the impact that it's had on our communities. So it may not be the answer that you're looking for. I mean, I don't want to. I will chair the commission, but I will. I think the decision about what happens should be one that is made by those 15, but also a decision that is made by all of the boroughs and by Londoners themselves. So if you make decisions here in this part of London, in Lambeth, and you make recommendations to Sonia and to others, then those are the sorts of decisions that I think we should honour and try to support. So yeah, a semi-answer, a bit of a deflection, but one that actually firmly puts it back in the hands of Londoners, because Londoners are the ones who have to see and look at and walk past these memorials and statues and monuments every day, and so they should be the ones to decide what happens to them.
Yes, great. Thank you, Debbie. And I think it was an honest response. Clearly, you know, it's a bigger, much bigger picture, much broader decision-making process. John, did you want to come back on this one also?
I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, I think as an archivist, temperamentally, I would want the record of were there to be any changes. I think it would also be important to make sure that those things still continue to exist in some other environment, as Debbie was perhaps suggesting. I think it would be a mistake to simply kind of try and erase things.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's a difficult one, and clearly it's we've talked about this before, that toppling a statue does not eradicate discrimination and racism. So there's a great deal more to it, and I wonder then that, you know, members of the committee have asked, so if you want to take down a statue, what then do you replace it with? Perhaps the British Museum's idea of retain and explain, that's, you know, something that, you know, everyone, this is a conversation that's taking place across the country right now, and it's good that it is taking place. So I think we'll leave this one for now, because it's one that we need to focus on. It's a much bigger picture. Someone here, John, it's more of a comment that Bligh was on a Royal Navy mission to get the breadfruit, which surely points to the Navy being pro-slavery. It does not really show what Bligh's own views might have been.
No, I'd agree with that, and I think when I was referencing Bligh, I was using him as an example of someone who was just sort of very tangentially linked with the slave trade, and my point really there was that it was such a pervasive economic force that all sorts of people, once you start looking, you discover that they're kind of embroiled in it in some way or other. I wasn't seriously suggesting that allowed us to define Bligh's position on slavery or the slave trade.
Okay, another one which is, says, do we need to think about a new framework for memorialisation? How do we memorialise collective action or liberatory ideals, values, rather than replicating, literally putting people onto plinths? Building and playgrounds named for Paul Robeson, Angela Davis, Michael Manley, Olive Morris, victims of the Bhopal disaster. Murals by Black artists Tam Joseph and Gavin Janis all have gone. John, do you want to pick up on that one? Because I think that's not too dissimilar to some of the points you made or have made, based on some of our buildings that have now disappeared, that were commemorating people, diversity in the community. Yeah,
it's an interesting point, isn't it? That back in 1984, 1985, Lambeth had named buildings after figures like Paul Robeson and Olive Morris, and yet they they have been allowed to lapse. Not I think through any kind of deliberate attempt to get rid of them. I mean, it's more a reflection that the number of council buildings that the council needs and uses has shrunk, and so they have kind of been converted to other uses. Maybe one thing to look at would be to revisit some of those names that had previously been used and to find new uses for them.
Okay, another one. How many of the monuments, statues, memorials identified, etc., are subject to the Historic England listing or church faculty protection? Some of the monuments are marking the burial place of an individual. Yeah, that was it. John, would you mind?
Okay. Yeah, we were on the subject of statues. Both Tate and the St Thomas's statue are both listed and so protected in their current locations by legislation, and that would need to be kind of if they were to be removed, then that would need to be altered in some way. The question of memorials, yes, we were asked to look at religious memorials in churches, and we've again, while it's not complete, we've included some instances. I don't think there's any suggestion. I mean, we've been including those as simply part of the request as to what we were asked to research. I don't think there is any intention to interfere with those, because, as the questioner rightly points out, they're not statues. They're personal memorials, personal funeral memorials.
Right, and Debbie, the same one, but on a broader outlook on this question, is it something that's been touched on, when discussing the mayor's thoughts on the diversity in the public realm, at how, the difficulties around these type of historic England, the listings and so on?
So we haven't got into the technical discussions about that so much, but what I think is actually quite important, both about what you've said and what John said, and indeed in the question, is that I think there is, and I think David Olusoga has said this as well, there is a real preoccupation with statues and memorials and monuments, and I think one of the things that we do need to be aware of is that the way in which you memorialise an individual is something which, it reflects Victorian Britain, yes, but it's also something that happened quite a while ago. And there are very different ways, and there are a range of different ways to both memorialise, represent and remember. I think one of the things that I think we will want to do with this commission is to go beyond thinking about memorials and thinking about statues and thinking about monuments, but also to think about public art. So some of the points in that question about murals and about street art. Our public space is so varied, and remembering the contribution that people have made from various communities doesn't necessarily have to be something that is only represented in a statue or in a monument. There are other ways to memorialise, and I think what I'm really keen for us to think about as a commission is what that looks like, not just the question about who is memorialised, but how, and having different ways of marking a contribution which better reflects that diversity as well. I mean, if we were to think about what happened this summer with the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the way in which people were galvanised and took to the streets, if there were individuals within that movement who you wanted to remember, or if you wanted to even remember what happened in the summer, you wouldn't necessarily put up a statue or a memorial. You'd think about something else that might be able to do that more innovatively, and also, reflect what people were doing and the energy, and also the broader issues around racial and social justice. So I think the question is a really good one, and I think I do think we need to think about the different ways to remember and the different ways to memorialise, and whether memorialising is the word we need to use, and just thinking about public art in all its diversity.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Debbie. And you're quite right. Even the language we use is very important. And I think you've eloquently described the absolute necessity for community engagement in these processes to get the views and what does it look like. It needn't be a statue, just to get people and our children in schools, education, how do they look to the future? What do statues mean to them? Do you know, does it have the same meaning? So yes, it's a great deal there. Another excellent question here. It says conditions in Jamaica post-slavery, when Tate's sugar business began, were appalling and led to the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion, which was brutally put down by the British governor. Does this mean we should at least acknowledge this history in a plaque next to the Tate statue? I think that's for you, John.
Okay, I think I think the approach of contextualizing existing memorials is a really good one. As I said about Tate, the statue is there. The statue of Windsor Square is there because to commemorate his philanthropy in donating the open space to the people of Lambeth. But there is nothing alongside that statue at present to explain any more about Tate, and I think that the principle behind that suggestion is a good one. That sort of finding ways of recontextualizing old history and bringing out different elements of it is certainly an interesting approach.
Yes, I totally agree. It's when we discuss what then do we do with the statues, what then becomes of them, and do we keep the statues? And then again, when I use the term, I think came from the British Library about retain and explain, and to be and it's the truth actually. It's finding the truth in those historical artifacts and bringing them to light and sharing that truth, so that it's that equality, that and openness, I think, that we're looking for in our historical artifacts, and certainly around this process. There's nothing like giving a community a sense of belonging, that community cohesion, if they can, their environment also recognizes their existence. They can see part of their past within their environment. You're shaking your head, Debbie. Do you agree? Great, thanks. Another one. The Church of England was missing from John Newman's presentation. John?
Well, it wasn't completely, in the sense that Archbishop Juxon was there as an individual bishop and archbishop of the church, but I'm not sure what the question means there. Yes, of course, the church owned individual churchmen, and I believe the church was involved in the slave trade, but we didn't uncover any particular local links to it. So haven't so far.
Thank you, John. I think this one's a statement again. Tate was also a global company by the beginning of the 20th century and bought huge plantations in Guyana, Trinidad and Jamaica. Tate's exploitative labour conditions led to the 1930s labour rebellion. Then we have, in doing some research, I had read that Lord Holland was considered an abolitionist. Is that true, John? I think it's based on your presentation on Lord Holland.
I don't know. What we do know is that he changed his name to Vassell so that he would be able to benefit from his wife's plantations in Jamaica, and we also know that he received compensation in 1836 under the Compensation Act after the abolition of slavery. It's perfectly possible that he may also have personally been opposed to to slavery, but he was also a beneficiary of it.
Okay, thanks. Another one, how are we getting involvement of young people with this, and what support is being given in this history, as this history is very gruesome, painful and emotional? I think that sort of sort of ties in with one of the questions we had earlier when I responded about the engagement. Debbie, do you want to come in here around the young people, whether it's something that's been discussed again around the diversity in the public realm?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, to be honest, because when you think about community engagement, obviously our communities are diverse in terms not just of ethnicity, but also in terms of age. And there does need to be a big education piece that goes alongside this. And this probably feeds into the sort of the retain and explain notion that you were discussing a little bit earlier, Sonia, which is that we do have to ensure that everything that we do around all of these issues are explained clearly for all to understand. It's not even just about sort of speaking to our opponents or people who might disagree or people who take real issue with how offended a person or group might be by a statue or a street name. We also need to ensure that young people are completely aware of what's happening, but also recognizing that these are very traumatic issues to discuss. And I think this also links into work that I know lots of people, including all of you here in Lambeth, are doing around the curriculum and diversifying it and making sure that children have history lessons in which they not only see themselves represented, but they learn about colonialism and they learn about the transatlantic slave trade. And there's been lots of really terrible stories about the ways in which slavery has been taught in some schools. You know, I've heard really terrible stories about teachers who have taught lessons about slavery and had all of the very few black children in a class be the ones dressed up as slaves and everyone else be dressed up as slave owners, and use that to demonstrate what slavery must have been like. We need to get better at the way at the way we teach history, but also about the content of history. And I think that actually the work around the curriculum in schools has to go alongside this type of work looking at our public spaces. I don't think you can have one without the other, and it makes history come alive for children, quite frankly, if they're able to learn about something in their classrooms and then be able to walk around a space and see it for themselves. So I'm actually really excited about what we could do potentially with this work to really help schools to and give, you know, lots of teachers the permission that some of them are seeking to be able to teach really interesting and vibrant lessons with their children and with their students.
Right, thank you. Totally agree, Debbie. Part of this community engagement is key linkages with Lambeth schools to review and amend the existing curriculum around the history of slavery and how the British economy developed in the 17th and 18th century, including decisions such as use of slavery, its eventual abolition in 1807, and then implemented across the British Empire in 1811. And again, John, you might want to come in here. I just wanted to add also a context-setting educational programme with Lambeth Archives and local and libraries, Lambeth Archives and libraries, both of whom have played a key role in this review of locations with existing historical links. John, did you want to come in here? Because I know before COVID, you had a very good educational programme running with our local schools.
Yeah, we've certainly been able to produce some resources on the schools on Black history in the past, and it's certainly something that we'd be happy to look at doing in kind of coming out of this whole process. Yeah.
Thanks. I have another question here, and I'm mindful of time. So this one is, what is the next move for the council from here? And is there any time scale to the actions that will be made following this inquest? I'm going to bring in Paul Bates, our Director of Communications here, who will take us through the next steps and how, well, indeed, I don't know that we have a timescale because, I mean, this is limitless, actually. I mean, we'll keep going because there's so much more to do, and we've recognised here it's not an easy task, but it's nonetheless, it's part of it will be very difficult, very uncomfortable conversations to be had, but nonetheless it needs to be done. So Paul, can you come in and give us an update on next steps, please?
Certainly, Sonia, and a big thank you to everybody who's joined today's event. I hope it's been useful, and we're going to continue the debate for a bit longer yet. This is only the first of what will be a series of engagement events, both online and offline. But because of COVID, we're having to amend and look again at how we run consultations and seek the views of people in the borough on this process. And as both Debbie and Sonia and John have mentioned, this is not a short, quick piece of work. It's going to be something that's going to take time, but it needs to be informed by the views and expertise and sense of history of the people of Lambeth. So the next step after Christmas will be a further engagement event around schools, and we're going to be engaging Lambeth schools in that. And then the consultation will continue probably until the end of February, and then we'll need to assess all of the opinions and views and then work out the next steps. But today's event is just the first. If you haven't got your question submitted today and it's not been answered, don't worry. We'll pick it up and make sure it's logged. And the online consultation will be available from the close of this meeting. And if you go to the lambeth.gov.uk website, you'll find it there, and you can click through to it and submit your views and have a bit more information on the history of Lambeth. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, it was. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. So we'll continue. I am keeping an eye on the time, but I'm sure we can take a few more questions. So the next one is, what is the benchmark to recognise, acknowledge, celebrate individuals? Does it boil down to a popular vote? Is it just individuals, or should groups, companies or organisations also be considered? In addition, I'm mindful this focus on Black, Caribbean, African history, but what about other ethnic cultural groups? Debbie, I'm going to throw this one right at you because of the public realm and the diversity, because that's the umbrella really that we're all sitting under.
Yeah, no, and it's a really good question. So the first thing is that when we first began to think about the diversity in the public realm idea, it developed out of the work that we were doing around the Millicent Fawcett statue. So it developed out of us recognising how few women there were who were memorialised anywhere in London, and then obviously with events this summer. We decided to bring forward the announcement and say that we were going to start the process of developing the commission. So the diversity that we are looking at is diversity in its widest sense. It's about ethnic diversity, gender diversity, LGBTQ plus, disabled people, and working class individuals or working class histories. And that's because these are, and there are lots of other groups obviously that we could also include, but these are definitely the groups that we know are very rarely seen properly represented in our public realm. So the commission will be focused on making sure we hear and understand the very different contributions made from all of those communities to London, and for us to think about how we can best mark that contribution, remember it, represent it, whatever that looks like. And I think the point also about people and groups is also important. So I mentioned we've got a partners board, and the partners board is currently made up of Black Cultural Archives, Innova, Historic England and the Arts Council, and there may be other institutions who we asked to join that board, and that's because we recognise that some of the questions that we will need to answer in this process will be about some of those thorny issues that you were discussing earlier, about what's difficult to move, what's difficult to change. We also have to think about planning. We also need to think about business interests. And so our partners board may increase to include a variety of other bodies that represent all of those interests. And that's because this work is bigger than just us thinking about, looking at some statues and thinking about what we need to do to be more representative. We actually have to think about how we do it. And that's why we're also trying to develop a boroughs working group that I mentioned before, which will include Lambeth, which will include all 33 boroughs. And that's because the ones ultimately who get to think and make the decision about this will be local authorities. We don't own that much land at the GLA. Local authorities also own a lot more land, but also we do have to recognise there's a lot of private land ownership as well, where there may be items on display that people feel do not adequately represent them, or private land in which they think something that better represents them should stand. So we also need to work and engage with private owners where relevant. So it's about making sure we're talking to the right people, and then also integral to all of this is the community engagement work, which Lambeth is doing such a great job on. Having events like this is exactly the sort of thing that we need. Answering those questions, but also there's been some really great suggestions already from your residents about things that could go next to statues, about historical events that we need to see reflected and represented somewhere. So we just need to make sure we're getting it right and talking to the right people, and then we will start having the conversations that we need to have about what the public realm needs to look like.
Great, thanks. Doreen, you've touched on some of the possible difficulties when you mentioned private land, removal of statues and monuments from private lands, and the legal framework which surrounds this. So yeah, it's a big one. John, did you want to come in here, mainly based around your research, whether you were contacted from various community groups, those who felt exactly as that question is posed here, around different ethnic cultural groups, whether you came across any of those comments or messages?
No, the focus of the research was on obviously the transatlantic slave trade, but we also looked at colonialism more generally, and I see from one of the later questions on chat, people asking that same question about whether other groups need to be represented in this. And for example, in the list of street names and memorials and statues that we've put together, you'll find some references, for example, to the East India Company as well. So we've included where we've come across them. References to families that were involved in or working for the East India Company. Was that the kind of
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. Another one then, it says, I applaud this initiative, although I have reservations over renaming streets. I recall the furore over the Rhodesia Road name change in the 80s. It was suggested that the part of the road which is unoccupied be renamed Zimbabwe Road. It didn't occur. The furore was not due to any support from Cecil Rhodes, but the sheer upheaval, sorry, I can't read this, but the sheer upheaval with regards to the street name change for the residents. So it's around the residents, the street name change, and which is something we've said it's not as easy as it sounds. So John, do you want to take that one? Because I think you covered it earlier on.
Yes, I was aware of the Rhodesia Road furore back in 1984. It was one of the triggers, I believe, for the council then adopting the anti-apartheid statement that it made in May '84. I think the problems that the Rhodesia Road incident in '84 illustrates have not gone away. I mean, if anything, being required to change your address is a hugely disruptive thing, and I suspect something that most people, even if, as with the questioner, even if they agree with the principle, hugely. Sorry,
I thought you froze for a moment. Thank you, John. The next question: how does the council engage the Black community in this process? So I'll start with this one, and I would really like to think that the Black community are already engaging in the process when we took this forward, and Lambeth way in announcing the audit, and it was based on leading on from the Black Lives Matter movement and the work we're doing in Lambeth around our Equalities Commission and the diversity in Lambeth. So I think I would like to hear more from this person. If you can email me or but engage. Everyone has the opportunity to engage with this project and online, as well as you can contact me if you feel there are other ways we could engage with the Black community. Specifically with the Black community, we are, as I said earlier, taking forward a number of community engagement programs, as with COVID, the highlighting of the disproportionality which is around the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community. So we're having that conversation so we can bring this there also. So if you have any further ideas how we can do it better, then please let me hear it, because that's the whole point. I want the community as a whole to engage in this. This isn't just a Black community issue. This is it is for all of us to have that dialogue, and that's the part that I want to take forward. This is the whole objective of the consultation, the community engagement. Debbie, do you want to come in there on anything on here around the engagement, and certainly the point about the Black community? I do know you're looking at the diversity, but I think it's a bigger picture, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and it's a good question, and also making sure that we're engaging with a community that often may not necessarily feel that it gets the opportunity to take part in consultations or in engagement processes. So one of the reasons why we asked the Black Cultural Archives to be part of our Partners Board was to help us with some of this work, because we know that they do so much work locally with communities, with the Black community in that part of London, but also around the whole of London, quite frankly. And so for us, engagement with communities, particularly with the Black community, will be about working with trusted, the organisations that they trust, the organisations and the spokespeople with whom they have rapport, and working through them to make sure that we are engaging as much as possible to ensure that their views are heard. And I think because this started, well, it didn't start with this, but because a lot of the conversation around statues has, quite frankly, been around those who have links to the transatlantic slave trade, it's imperative that we are doing that form of engagement with Black communities who are the ones who have for whom the impact of slavery has been long-lasting, historical, and never really been properly addressed. So we will do all we can to reach out and do that proper engagement, and also get communities to work with us to think locally about their heroes, to think locally about those who they think have made the real contributions where they live, and for us to have a proper conversation about how we properly represent those individuals in London.
Yeah, and it's linked to the question earlier on around the trauma of slavery, so which is very important that we do have this conversation and bring this about. Okay, another one, why are you concentrating only on the transatlantic slave trade? Colonialism was mentioned in the introduction, but little covered in the presentation. There are huge local connections to the activities of the East India Company. Are you reviewing these as well? John, I'd sent that one to you.
Yeah, that was the question I sort of half picked up on. That was the question that I half picked up on in the last one. Yes, obviously the initial focus was on the transatlantic slave trade, and then we were asked to kind of include colonialism, which was something of a challenge in that it was so far-reaching. If you look at the list that is compiled and published on the document that's available online, you'll see that there are some instances of, for example, individuals involved with the East India Company and other colonial activities. Rhodesia Road obviously features on it as well, as something with links to a kind of a colonial history. So it's not something that we've neglected, but and there are some instances on the list. I guess the focus of the presentation that I gave was more though on the links with the slave trade that seemed to be more at the forefront of the discussion.
Thank you, John. There's another one which I will throw back at you. It's memorising beyond statues. Debbie's comment about capturing energy of community actions. What investments or strategies does Lambeth have to archive media, video, audio, or oral from social movements and activism? I'm aware the BCA is doing this, but are there other efforts? I thought you might want to talk about your digitisation, John, and the archives and going forward.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. The role of Lambeth Archives is to act as the kind of repository, not just for the council and its records, but for the records of all of Lambeth's communities and in all media. And we are slowly getting up to speed with that need. So in terms of capturing archives of community engagement, for example, we hold the archive of Olive Morris, the Black Panther and Brixton activist, and the archives of the Remember Olive Collective and the oral history program that they initiated. So yes, we are. I mean, that's just one example. We are recently taken in the archives of the Oval House Theatre Company, which is like the kind of the Lambeth birthplace for so many different radical theatre movements. So we are always extremely interested in capturing the histories of different Lambeth communities. And ensuring that our archive going forward for researchers in the future can be as representative as possible of the whole diversity of Lambeth's communities. Thank you, John.
The next one, please also bear in mind that the enslavement of people of African descent is a portion of Black history. The history of Black people did not start here. It was vast and far-reaching, and there's a lot more to be proud of. And I totally agree. I also feel that this whole project looking at slavery and colonialism is about bringing about the truth and the good things, the fantastic achievements of Black people in history. And I feel this is very much part of it. It's not about just focusing on them as slaves, but actually their contributions to society, to the country, to our environment, and that's what I'm taking from this. Debbie, do you want to take it through?
I mean, I completely agree. I think I think that it's important for us to use this opportunity to think about contribution, and contribution can be historical contribution, and contribution can be what's happening right now. I mean, I'm thinking about, given that we're having this conversation in the way that we're having it, it obviously reflects on the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we know how that pandemic has impacted upon Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities in particular. And we also know that there have been many who have put themselves really at risk of contracting the virus simply through the jobs that they do, those front-facing jobs that often go not unsupported, but they never necessarily get the recognition that they deserve. I know that Patrick Vernon, who worked on the 100 Great Black Britons, commissioned a piece of artwork which was reflecting on those Black and Asian frontline workers who lost their lives in the very early stages of the pandemic, and those are also some of the ways in which you can talk about and memorialize and represent contribution. There are so many contributions that people have made throughout this entire year, and we do need to remember those individuals, because everything that happens is historical. I tell my kids this all the time. You make history every time you do something, and so it doesn't have to be solely about, for example, the transatlantic slave trade, even though it's incredibly important for us to remember that. It doesn't just have to be solely about colonialism, although colonialism has had an incredibly important impact on our communities. It can also be about local heroes, people who have just gone above and beyond, or just do those little things that people really are so thankful for, and are creating history in the way in which they do that. And we should think about how we memorialize those individuals. So it can be about that as well. And I think this can be an opportunity for Lambeth, but also for London, to do something really interesting and innovative about our public realm, and take some of the heat out of the debate that has really got quite tense and quite divisive about statues. It's not just about those things. It can be about so much more. And I think we've got a really good opportunity to do something interesting.
Thank you, Debbie. And I'm now going to take the final question, which I think all three of us can manage this one. And it says, are you doing anything to address the guilt being placed particularly upon the white population, especially white children, by this campaign? I'll take this, I'll go first. And we talked earlier around trauma and of the slave trade. And I see this as a period of education, of enlightenment, of truth. And it's not about placing guilt, but sharing and unearthing an untold history, or changing the narrative. So whilst we're discussing the trauma, if the guilt, this can all be, if we talk, Debbie, you mentioned the classroom environment, and this is about how you deliver this information, how you share it, how you unearth this history. And I feel it's very much about learning for both the black and white. It's not down to one or the other. It's a collective. It's not, the responsibility is not on one or the other. We want to unearth the truth, the history, and to share it, that enlightenment, the truthfulness, which I think all our children deserve. Over to you, Debbie.
I mean, I completely agree with everything that you said, Sonia. It's not about guilt. It's about making sure that we have a better conversation about historical legacy. We have a better conversation and an honest conversation about the legacy of transatlantic slavery. The thing that, I've worked in race equality for a very long time, and the thing that always used to irk me a little bit was that whenever you wanted to have an open and honest conversation about the impact that something terrible has had on the lives of those individuals who experienced it and their generations, that there would always be this kind of sort of, well, what does this mean for me? It doesn't have to be, that's not the type of conversation that we need to be having. I think we need to have a conversation which acknowledges that Britain's history, and this is British history, Britain's history has been checkered. It has not always been positive. And the type of history that I learned in school was a history in which I learned that Britain's role in the world was always amazing and wonderful and great and positive, and that is simply not true. And I think what we have the challenge of doing something interesting with what we now know and what we're now being able to discuss and opening out to everyone, and it's just, I think we just need to have the opportunity to have that conversation in schools, but also have that conversation in our homes, have our conversations in the hairdressers, have the conversation everywhere. We are having the conversation now. It's a divided conversation, and to be quite frank, what I would like to see in a good few years' time, when Lambeth has finished this, gone through this process, when we have gone through our commission and we've got to a particular place where we're thinking about what we want to put up, that we are having a better quality conversation about the impact that some negative things in British history, as well as positive things, have had on Britons. And I think that's the aim. That's what we should be looking forward to having. It doesn't have to be about guilt. It needs to be about openness and honesty and truth and recognition that this is all part of all of our histories, and it's important for us to have the conversation.
Thank you. John, can I come over to you as an archivist? Do archivists speak about guilt, or is it just about sharing that information, unearthing the history and putting it out there?
I think my, speaking from my kind of professional position as an archivist, my interest would be in getting all the different versions of the history made available. I don't think I have anything to add to what you've already said on guilt.
Right, thank you very much, John. I think I'm going to wrap it up here, and just to sum up that what we've all outlined here is that this is a very important time, for this conversation, this dialogue. So many across the country are participating. It's the Black Lives Matter movement has mobilised. They have started this dialogue, and in Lambeth we are actually very proud to be taking it forward, to be leading on this. It's not an easy task, it's not going to be easy, but what we do want is for as many members of our community to participate as possible, and certainly some of those questions I will be looking at and taking forward some of the ideas and how best we can improve on our engagement process going forward based on these questions. And just to say that there will be more information on our Lambeth community talk, our residents magazine, also via social media. And please do submit your ideas, suggestions and comments, and read the information we've got outlined on the website. So please, everyone who's tuned in this afternoon, all the 500 of you, thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this, and we want this to continue. We want you to continue to be part of it, to share and to send in your views, because your opinions, we want to hear them. There are different views, different ideas, and that's the beauty of this conversation as we come together. I'd like to thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much for your time. It's been invaluable having you here and to hear the work you're taking forward, the beginnings of the diversity in the public realm. Thank you very much for your time. Dawn, you joined us. I'm sorry we missed you, Dawn. I believe you had technical problems getting through. John, thank you so much for your presentation. It's always great. We've had you in Lambeth for such a long time, and we are so blessed to have you with your knowledge and putting together this presentation for us. And it's a continued learning curve. Thank you, Paul, for putting all this in together, to outline the programme. And the technical team, you've kept us going. Thank you all so much. And again, to our listeners and those there who've joined in, thank you so much, and please continue the dialogue. Thank you.